Well, China's rise is basically an old story of international relations realism. As a country becomes wealthier and more powerful, it has more influence on the international stage. As it has the potential for influence, it tends to try to pursue that influence. So that obviously is implicitly something of a threat to the power and interest of the previously dominant power, in this case, the United States. And so it's a question of accommodating to that. So that's sort of the most basic phenomenon and why you get somewhat negative reaction from the US and other Western powers. But I think there are other issues overlaying on that. One is that China's rise occurred in a particular way. It occurred through China's deep interdependence economically with the outside world. And so what that has meant is, I think, in recent times, two things. One is that the United States and Western economies are potentially vulnerable to shocks from China, including political uses of economic leverage. So that creates an additional concern. And I think the rapid progress of economic integration with China and how that sped China's development and rise in power has led to a bit of a backlash. The belief that it did not lead to changes in China's international behavior or even in China's domestic order that some people in the West, I think, kind of naively or over-optimistically hoped for, that with economic interdependence would come political change. And that's partly the fault of Western leaders. When the U.S. promoted and supported China's entry into the WTO, for instance, the domestic U.S. politics of that was to say this would change China and make it more like a U.S.-style system. That was naive and probably a little overreaching. So there's that blowback. And I think there also was an implicit belief in kind of constructivist theory that China, through engagement, would bring into its domestic order and even its foreign policy behavior a set of changes that would be conforming. And of course, that's not always how it works. And now the shoe is almost on the other foot, to use an American idiom. That is that China is now seen as influencing global rules, and those rules that China prefers are not necessarily the same ones that the US and the West previously preferred, so there's that kind of friction. And I would say finally, there was a belief that institutions could impose constraints even if ideational change did not happen. And there has been some frustration with, in the US view in particular, the inability of the WTO, the UN Human Rights Council, you pick any institution, to really sort of constrain or change or shape China's behavior as much as some had hoped. So pick your international relations theory. On every front, there is either mounting influence and therefore potential threat perceived from China, or frustration with hoped for changes in China and Chinese behavior not coming about. So that, I think, all of those things coalesce in a rather negative view of what's going on. I guess one other thing I would lay over on that is people talk about a new Cold War. I don't think we're there, but there is clearly an ideological difference between the two systems, very different in values at home, and that just sort of reinforces this dynamic of a sense of competition and potential conflict. Well, so many of the factors that shape U.S.-China relations are fairly deep and structural at this point. It doesn't depend too much on who's holding office. So this sense of relative power shift, this sense of the economic frictions in the relationship, the sense of some rather different values, all of those are there and they're not going to change. And one of the striking things, I'm sure this has been striking to people in China, is in some ways the lack of change in U.S.-China policy from Trump to Biden. A very contentious election in the U.S., but the tariffs remained in place, the lack of progress on a lot of these issues remained in place. The U.S. is backing Taiwan more strongly than ever, perhaps. A lot of these things that do not seem to have altered much. That said, I think whether policy will remain stable in a more micro level in the next several years, the post-U.S. election period, I think that depends. If it's Biden, I think you will see an extremely high level of continuity. He's had a very coherent set of policies toward China, like them or don't like them, that they've been, I think, fairly clear. With Trump, who knows? I think, although, as I mentioned earlier, there's been some continuity between Trump and Biden in terms of substance, it's a very different style, much more volatile, much more unpredictable under Trump. And I think the underappreciated story is that Trump term 2 is not necessarily Trump term 1. That you will see a very different group of people around him. You will see a world that has changed in many ways. And I think we still don't know how much Trump will be really antagonistic toward China on the basis of whether he blames China for his loss in the election because of COVID or something, or whether he just is going very much more toward the nativist, populist, anti-international engagement side of the Republican Party. The other thing I would say is that foreign policy in the U.S., as in China and as in other places, often reflects domestic politics. And with a Trump victory, domestic politics will be in crisis. And it's unclear what that will mean for foreign policy. There'll be some crisis with Biden because Trump supporters may not accept the Biden victory. But if Trump wins, I think we're headed for a real constitutional crisis and severe political conflict, which will limit the U.S.'s ability to act effectively on the international stage, but also may lead to even greater instability and departures from past norms in U.S. foreign policy. Well, I think the U.S. is seeing the BRI as very much a Chinese initiative. It's very much about China's infrastructure investment. And in a way, the BRI and the AIIB and that whole structure of Chinese initiatives was able to gain the kind of traction that it did, in part because the U.S. set itself against it. The U.S. did not agree to World Bank reform. It didn't agree to expanding the kind of aid that would be necessary to, or the kind of investment that would be necessary to build infrastructure. So there was a real unmet need there. China stepped into that with the BRI and the AIIB and things like that. So from the beginning, the U.S. had a kind of a negative view of it. So it's not surprising that has persisted. And because nobody quite knows exactly what the BRI is or how to characterize it, virtually everything China does internationally in terms of investment and economics, certainly anything involving infrastructure, especially in the global south, in the U.S. gets viewed through this lens of U.S.-China rivalry, and gets viewed through the lens for the worst critics of China in the U.S. of debt trap diplomacy, and it's got this very political overtone. As to BRICS expansion, I think it is seen in many circles in the U.S. as another step along that path, a worse version of what I've just described, because BRI is very diffuse. There's a good economic argument, or at least a good policy argument, for a lot of what it does. If you're talking about expanding a structure like BRICS, that was always seen as a Chinese initiative to kind of balance the United States, and it's seen as trying to put more of an institutional structure around what was otherwise a more inchoate or more diffuse set of political connections. So it's been greeted with a lot of suspicion. Well, I think the question is exactly right, that it is a two-edged sword, and you see it cutting both ways, as two-edged swords often do. So certainly social media has the potential and has, in some cases, had the effect of promoting mutual understanding. But when I think of what my students do in terms of social media exchanges, Weixin or whatever, with their friends in China, there was nothing like that when I was their age. If you wanted to have significant contact with China, you had to come here. And it would be, limited to the year when you were doing your field work or several shorter visits. It certainly wasn't instantaneous. So that's changed, and that's been for the good. And I think it has enabled people in both countries who otherwise wouldn't have contact because they're not particularly committed to engaging the other country to do that. And that's all good. And it's been a vehicle for, I think, having a broader band appreciation of the other society. So American culture has always easily gotten out. But now with TikTok and other things like that, snippets of Chinese culture make their way to Americans. And that's mostly for the good. Chinese movies, all that sort of stuff too. The problem, of course, is that social media has all the pathologies we know about. It leads to people seeking out input that confirms their suspicions. It tends to lead to this kind of maximum controversy and conflict, the dopamine hits people get from seeing something that really energizes them. And I think that's been true in domestic social media in the U.S. Clearly, it's true in U.S.-China interactions as well. So I think net, if you had to sort of quantify the effects, I'd say, unfortunately, it's probably been a net negative, just because of the tendency toward conflict. And of course, the growing concern now is willful disinformation. That is, the strategic uses by state actors or state-aligned or partisan actors to try to sow discord, to try to achieve certain political results. That obviously creates a much worse political dynamic around it. Well, I think you've already seen some of it happen. The shadow here is the shadow of the pandemic, when, of course, person-to-person ties in person were reduced to practically nothing, and a lot of other exchanges were suspended. So I think we're seeing some progress on that front. The number of flights is up. Chinese students always were coming to the U.S., but now they're really coming again in larger numbers and not doing things by Zoom. U.S. students coming to China, obviously much slower recovery, but just the sense that that there is travel back and forth more is a good thing. The number of flights are going up, visas are getting somewhat easier again. I think I would continue to go down those paths to promote that kind of exchange. I think the U.S. has a lot of work to do in terms of encouraging young Americans, particularly students, to come to China. There's a concern, especially for those who are likely to be most interested, say those who might think of a career in government. They have been told implicitly and sometimes explicitly not to come to China for long periods because it makes it hard to get a security clearance. That sort of thing, excuse me, is nonsense and has to be dealt with. And I think that the leadership level matters too. That is, although the relationship obviously is deeply troubled at the moment, the fact that on both sides there's been an attempt to put a floor under it, put some guardrails. The presidents meet, the cabinet level, the ministry level people meet. That kind of helps set a tone that I think encourages it. And then from that flows, I think, a signal that visits are welcome. I mean, I've been getting more invitations again than used to be the case in the immediate post-pandemic thing, and I think that's true of my colleagues here. So I hope it continues because although not all exchanges are entirely cordial, and we certainly have disagreements, talking is much better than not talking. Well, they're the ones that are very hard to solve. The security and economic relationships, I think, are in deep trouble in a variety of ways. If you ask most people what their list is, usually at the top of the list are climate change and public health. And there's a really strong functional argument for both of those. Climate change cannot be solved without U.S.-China cooperation. Both states have a huge interest in fixing it for their own purposes as well as for global purposes. And obviously with the pandemic, we learned how interdependent and therefore vulnerable we are and how important it is to have good response mechanisms and to have ways of creating what we need in the way of vaccines and public health supplies and so on. And they're not obviously politically charged. It's not a sovereignty question. It's not a global power question, something like that. That said, though, I'm still a little worried because if you dig into the details about how to do the cooperation, it suddenly gets very hard. We still have a little bit of the flavor of climate change issues were caused by the global north, so how much should China and the global south have to bear the responsibility for that? The technology we need for green energy, the U.S. worries about China taking that technology and tech controls. The U.S., however, can't produce what it needs to produce in the way of electric vehicle batteries, solar panels, et cetera, without production links with China. And if you go down that path, then you're making yourself more vulnerable on both sides to disruptions of supply chain, either by accident or by political choice. So that gets very tough. If you look at public health, I think, and especially you asked earlier about the U.S. elections, if Trump wins, then I think we are potentially in a zone where it's going to be harder to get past the very ill feelings that came out of COVID and the reactions there too. I understand very much why Chinese feelings were bruised by the blame game that came on, and of course the U.S. had its complaints as well. So again, and we've seen a relatively, I think, slow progress on revising the international health regulations to deal with pandemics, and even U.S.-China cooperation isn't going to solve either of those problems entirely. So it's great to work on it. They're hopeful. There are ways, I think, to cooperate, but it's going to take some real skill and some real determination to work through the details to achieve meaningful progress. But any little bit helps. And there was an unfortunate phrase a while ago that there are no oases in the desert. That you can't have U.S.-China cooperation on these issues unless you have broader cooperation. I don't think that's true, and I certainly hope we're past that mindset. I'm actually a little more hopeful on the economic side. I mean, I think there are still huge issues there, but I think there's an appreciation that you can only go so far toward decoupling, and that some balance will ensue there. So it'll be tough on the high-tech stuff, but on other things, I'm hopeful we'll get over silly things like tariffs on low-tech goods and things of that ilk.